Good evening all. Great to see such a big turnout this evening. We're here with Colin Freeman, who happens to be the chief foreign correspondent at the Sunday Telegraph these days.
That's right.
I've known Colin from being on the road with him and having also previously written for the Telegraph. And I think we first encountered each other in Baghdad, didn't we?
Yes, I think we've had a few arguments on the news desk when I've been on the news desk and you've been
well, we don't
out on the road.
We don't have to go into that
on occasion.
So, as you will know from these frontline sessions, it's a bit like meeting the in-laws. You know, we interrogate you and we assess your character. And before we sort of delve into your book, which is just being released now.
Yeah, this week.
Which we have a copy of here, and Colin will be signing afterwards. Before we delve into that and what happened to you in Somalia, I wanted just to sort of get a bit more about your past career and how you got into this mad world of foreign journalism. You started off, and you mentioned this in the book quite early on, that you're a bit at the end of your tether. You've been working at the Evening Standard, haven't you?
Yes,
and you've been doing this sort of round of broken down trains and bad roads and even worse celebrities.
I like a lot of people, I did the usual thing of starting on a local paper and then moving to London, hoping that the streets would be sort of paved with gold. I got a job on the Standard, which was good for a few years, but as anyone who reads the Standard knows, there was a lot of news about commuting and roadworks and things like that in it. I did quite a lot of that coverage and worked quite hard at it, thinking it would get me further up the chain, and instead they just realised, oh, he quite likes writing about roadworks, so we'll keep him doing that. He's the man for the job. So in the winter of 2002, when the Iraq war was brewing and it was pretty obvious that it was going to go ahead, I decided to chance my luck as a freelancer in Iraq, as probably a number of people here have probably tried to chance their luck as a freelancer abroad. And so I went out there for a couple of years, and I actually missed the war as it happened. I tried to get out there for the war, but was basically too late. I'd left it too late. I arrived there on the day the war ended. Just literally within hours of arriving, George Bush declared that hostilities were officially over. So that was the end of my official war reporting career. But as we now know, yes, the real war in Iraq was just beginning, really. The invasion went very smoothly. The bit afterwards was where it all started getting rather more interesting. So,
and you have Michael Barrymore to thank for all this, don't you?
Yes.
Or indirectly.
Well, I was doorstepping his now late wife, Cheryl Barrymore, in 2002, when it was suggested to me by the photographer I was with when I was very bored that if I was so bored of doing doorsteps and writing about roadworks, then I should go out and do the war. And so I took him at his word. But,
it's a bit like go and play in the traffic kind of thing.
Yes, basically. So anyway, I was in Iraq for a couple of years, and then Iraq got too dangerous, really, to continue working there. Kidnapping was one of the big risks, so I decided that it'd be best to move back to London, and then worked on the Sunday Telegraph, where I ended up getting kidnapped in Somalia instead. So.
And it was during your time in Iraq that you took a bullet for the first time, is that right?
Yeah, the first and only time, yes.
Oh, first and only time,
yeah,
okay. Talk us through that. It sounds a bit hairy.
Old war stories. That was down in Basra in 2004. We went to a prayer meeting of the Mahdi army, who you may remember were the lot who were fighting the British back then. And we had a special invite from a local sheikh, so we thought everything would be okay. And then, unfortunately, as we left this prayer meeting, one of his lieutenants decided that I was a British spy. Not a very good British spy, given that we'd been right up at the podium listening to what this chap had been saying. But anyway, he wandered up behind me and fired a gun, his pistol right into the ground behind me. It felt like getting kicked very hard up the arse. And I thought initially, I didn't realise I'd been shot. I just thought the powder blast had deflected onto me. And he then tried to sort of threatened my translator with a gun. We didn't really know what was going on. Then got dragged into a big mob of people with an Arab TV crew busy filming away, thinking, oh great, we're going to get a live exclusive of a Westerner being beheaded here. Sadly, for their point of view, the Sheikh's deputy intervened after my translator ran and got him, and turned up in a Range Rover, and we drove off. And it was only then really that I realised my backside was beginning to hurt a bit, and I would have probably just gone back to Baghdad thinking it was just a scratch, but somebody else from the BBC who happened to be there said, look, you really ought to go to the hospital and get that checked out. And I said, well, I'll go to Basra Hospital. And they said, no, don't do that, because there's no X-ray facilities there. Go to the British Army Hospital. Julie went there, and sure enough, there was a .22 bullet in my backside, which I hadn't realised and wouldn't have done unless this BBC person had intervened. And luckily, though, it was a .22, for those of you who don't know, is quite a small bullet. The average Iraqi always carries a big thing like a 9mm or a 45 Magnum or a Colt 45 or something. This particular Iraqi was the only man in Iraq carrying what is basically a girl's gun. And then hence I am still here today, really. But as you can see, I have managed to...
It's not a great headline, is it?
No, yeah, shot in the backside by a girl's gun. Even my mum thought it was funny, which is, yes, it was not the great heroic war story that I was hoping to get.
But nevertheless, I mean, you know, leaving aside your backside for a second, I mean,
Thank you.
You know, this kind of risk that you're taking in Iraq and so on, did it not make you think at that time, oh, is this really the life for me?
Well, not really. I mean, lots of other people
were doorstep in the Barrymore family.
Lots of other people were doing the same thing, as we know, and the majority of the time, people go in and out of these situations without anything dreadful happening. Iraq did get quite dangerous, and a number of people I knew were kidnapped for one or two for several months on end by people like Al-Qaeda, who in other cases, for example, Ken Bigley and Nicholas Berg, did actually behead their victims. That didn't happen to any of the journalists, but as we know, it did become a very dangerous place for journalists to work in, and as a result, as time went on, very few people continued to work there. I personally gave up after a couple of years, but it was just, you know, you never really think these things are going to happen to you, no, to a certain extent, although in Iraq there was a point where if you hadn't had some horrible escapade at some point, you began to feel a bit left out and slightly anxious that when it did happen to you, it would be far worse than whatever happened to everybody else.
There's a lot of gallows humour as well,
there was,
which comes forward in your Somali book. I remember a colleague, actually one of your contemporaries at the Telegraph, saying he was going to get his teeth done before he went back to Iraq in case he did get beheaded, because he wanted to look, at least the teeth would look nice.
Yes, I can imagine, yeah. I was personally worried about appearing on a video with a moustache, which I grew to try and blend in, but which didn't really work very well.
So anyway, so you built up this experience of working in Iraq, and you've effectively become a sort of roving correspondent based out of London.
Yes.
And we'll come on to the story behind what happened with you in getting to Somalia in the first place. I've only been there myself once, and I found it a pretty terrifying experience. There were two things that stuck in my mind. One was that you could buy a passport for $5 and put whatever name you wanted on it. The only hitch being, I think you can only get to Djibouti and maybe one or two other places on that passport. But I do remember an Irish aid worker going back to Dublin and trying to get into Ireland on a Somali passport, which caused a bit of consternation. The other thing that struck me was going to a hospital in Mogadishu, and I think it was almost my first day, and there was a girl of about 7 or 8 and was having a bullet extracted from her shoulder, and without anaesthetic. And I said to the translator, if this is an English girl, she'd be bawling her eyes out. And she replied, well, that's because they're cowards. And I said to myself there and then, this is a different kind of place. I was kind of struck by that. Tell me about your experience of Somalia, because it wasn't the first time you've been there.
No, I went, not many British correspondents really go to Somalia very much. I mean, you'll meet people who've been to Iraq or Afghanistan dozens of times, or have even based themselves there for a year or two, as I have done. But very few people really go to Somalia for a number of reasons. One is that until relatively recently, it was kind of off the radar. It wasn't considered a terrorism threat or whatever. And the other is there are no there were none of the major strategic interests in terms of oil or former British interests there really. So it kind of gets left off the map, or off the radar rather, in terms of foreign coverage. So most of the people I know had not been there at all. I think, like you, been there. If they'd been there at all, they'd maybe been once. I went there in 2006 for the first time after Iraq, so it seemed relatively, in about the same league roughly as Iraq did in terms of danger. But I was pleasantly surprised at the time, because it was during the period when the Islamic Courts Union were in control of Mogadishu. They were an outfit, to use a loose shorthand, a little bit like the Taliban, in that they were an Islamist organization, and they had won support from people locally by just providing a degree of security and justice on the ground. People did not necessarily care for the Islamic ideological baggage that they brought with them, but they did like the fact that they could go to the local market without getting killed, or that they could drive through Mogadishu without getting half a dozen different militia checkpoints extracting money from them at will. And it was remarkable then that the whole place was pretty calm, really. Unfortunately, that period lasted only for about 3 months, 4 months, and then the Americans didn't really like the idea of the Islamists getting a reputation for security in the country, and nor did the neighbouring Ethiopians, and so with American connivance the Ethiopians invaded, and then all hell promptly broke loose, and you now have the mess that Somalia is again today, with an Islamist insurgency fighting a Western-backed government, which not dissimilar to a number of other places around the world that we have at the moment.
Now, I mean, later on we're going to go to questions from the audience, but I want to kind of give a flavour of your book and talk a bit more about your story. Your decision to go to Somalia, I mean, you'd been there before, and going there on this mission, tell me about how the pirate story came about. I mean, you went there to hunt pirates, essentially,
well,
which some people might have thought you must be out of your mind.
Not exactly hunt them, but yeah, it wasn't really a mission. Is perhaps too grandiose a word. I was on another job in Pakistan, and the office suddenly rang and said, "Oh, have you heard about this big oil tanker that's been hijacked?" And this was in late 2000. It was a tanker called the Sirius Star, which is a big $100 million tanker, cost $150 million, carrying $150 million worth of oil, brand new, just sailed out of Saudi Arabia, and was actually several hundred miles from the Somali coast. And it suddenly brought showed to people that the pirates' reach was in a totally new league. It was a much bigger prize than anything they'd seized before, and it was far further afield than they'd previously been operating in, whereas prior to that they really were just a sort of threat in the immediate offshore area off Somalia. So that showed that they were in a different league. It was like them stealing a Spanish galleon full of, $100 billion worth of Spanish gold in the 18th century or something. So the officer said, "Can you find somewhere in Somalia where we can report on?" And as it happened, I had been scoping out a trip to the sort of pirate coast before, and just kept on putting it off, really, because A, the office didn't seem that interested prior to then, and B, it's obviously Somalia, it's always a bit of a difficult and dangerous mission. But on that occasion we looked and we found this town called Bosaso, which is a port town in northern Somalia, which is where most of the piracy operates, because the northern Somali coast is close to the Gulf of Aden, and it's ideally situated. It's a bit like if you were, say, a modern day Dick Turpin basing yourself at the Scratchwood services on the M1. You've got a perfect kind of reach into all the main traffic coming past you. So you can fly to Bosaso from Dubai and various other places via Djibouti, and so that was where we headed off. It's not actually a pirate town proper. You don't see Long John Silver wandering down the the harbour or whatever. But
no patches.
There's a lot of pirate money there. Lots of villas going up. Lots of people driving around in smart new SUVs, and it's also home to the Somali Coast Guard, who theoretically anyway are busy.
Well, we'll come on to
running up and down the coastline.
But when you got this call in Pakistan, said, "Colin, do you mind just going and checking out a few pirates in Somalia?" Did you not have a twinge of concern?
Well, no, they weren't quite as casual about it as that, but they knew that I'd been checking it out for a while anyway, and they said, like, is this the week, can you try and turn something around in this week? And for anybody who thinks that, you know, foreign correspondents get put under pressure to go to dangerous places, perhaps sometimes against their better judgment. In my experience, that never really happens. What they tend to say is, look, you're the guy you're the guy who's risking your arse out there. If you think it's safe, you go. But you know, there is no pressure. And I could easily have turned around and said, no, I'm sorry, I can't do it, and I can't risk it in the time that we've got, or whatever, or it's just too dangerous. Because honestly, most news desks, they don't want the paperwork, apart from anything else, of having a dead or kidnapped foreign correspondent on their hands. And
a lot of bureaucracy, isn't
the subsequent 6 weeks when I was kidnapped proved that time and again. But, so anyway,
you say in the book, though, that you're not the type who believes in this gushing sense of, oh, we're going to bear witness to the suffering. You do talk about the sense of adventure of being a foreign.
Yes, it's going to be. You also think, oh, well, this is going to be exciting, going to Somalia and seeing if we can meet some pirates for interview. That's going to be quite an interesting sort of prospect. It's not quite as balmy as you might immediately think, by the way. If you go to somewhere like that, well, some of you are probably thinking, well, what on earth would you want to do going and meeting some pirates? The first thing they're going to do is kidnap you. It doesn't always work like that. These people sometimes have a sort of message that they want to get out in the media. You know, in the pirates' case, it was about saying that they were taking revenge for foreign trawlers fishing in their waters. And also, if you have a good fixer in somewhere like that, these people often flip between the sort of legal world and the dodgy world, and they will often know someone who knows someone through clan connections or some other way.
But it was exciting, wasn't it?
Yeah.
The prospect was exciting.
Yes, it was exciting, and it also
Pirate,
seemed
sexy story,
vaguely feasible.
Somalia.
Yeah. Yes, yes.
Khat leaves.
Khat, yes.
So you basically you take this assignment and you hook up with a freelance photographer.
Yes.
And maybe you could explain a bit about that people like yourself, you're a staff correspondent, but then you meet up with a freelancer who you didn't even know before.
Yeah,
you obviously got kidnapped.
Again, the days, sadly, due to budgets and so on, the days when you had a photographer who was by your side every day of wherever you travel abroad these days are over. A lot of the time now you use local freelancers or people who are based in the region, which makes sense in a way as well, because they know the area better than you. And in particular, this photographer Jose, who I got kidnapped with, he was based in Ethiopia. He'd been to Somalia several times, so he was an obvious person to try and work with. And he'd worked with a colleague of mine prior to that, so and had also been scoping out the piracy story, coincidentally the same week, and had been in touch with our office. So it was a sort of unfortunate alignment of planets in a way.
Now I wanted you to talk a bit about how you work on the ground and how you worked on the ground with this, but I just want to delve into a bit of your books. It's a right rollicking read, this, by the way, and there's some great moments, and it's very revealing as well about how journalists try to operate in countries like Somalia, which is incredibly difficult, obviously, to operate in. And there's a great moment when you've just arrived, and you mentioned just now that Jose had fixed you up or hooked you up with these fixers, and I just want to read a little bit of the passage here because they become quite important later on, don't they? So Ahmed and Mustafa took us to a battered chrome and blue four-wheel drive. In a white Toyota pickup next to us was our armed escort, four ruffianly men dressed in green and brown fatigues and clutching Kalashnikovs. Like most Somalis, they had skinny, wiry frames on which their uniforms hung off them like scarecrows. The youngest looked only about 17 and sported big mirrored shades. The eldest looked like he could have been the 17-year-old's grandpa with a grinful of gold teeth under a floppy camouflage hat. Aren't we supposed to have 8 of them? I asked Ahmed. Understand one thing, he said. This is just for the drive to the hotel. It'll only take 10 minutes. We'll have 8 tomorrow. I didn't bother arguing. I never had much faith in the bodyguards anyway. It was one thing if they were ex-SAS men, like the ones that Sunday Telegraph had used when Baghdad had got particularly rough. Those you could reasonably expect to put up a fight on your behalf, especially given that they charged about £2,000 per day. Using the local nationals as they were known in bodyguard speak was different. Goldtooth and Company were on the going rate of $20 a day each, good by Somali standards, but unlikely to be enough for them to lay their lives down on your behalf. Scarecrows indeed was all they were. So you had these fixers lined up and you had these bodyguards. Is that how it works? Can you explain a bit more about that?
Yes, basically anybody who goes to Somalia certainly as a Westerner, you are a target for kidnapping. It's been like that for quite a number of years, really. And if you be it an aid worker, a businessman, journalist, whoever, you tend to use bodyguards. They're depending. You hire them through your fixer. They're often your sort of people who are cousins of your fixer. Sometimes they're sort of people who are nominally affiliated to some local police unit or something. Although the local law enforcement agencies don't really function that well out there anyway, so it never really matters that much. They generally tend to insist that you hire about 8 of them, even though, as I've said there, the chances of them laying their lives down for you for $20 a day are fairly limited. But it's rather like if you've ever been to a football match and had a bunch of kids come up to you when you park your car and said, "Can I mind your car for you, mister?" It's rather like that same sort of thing. It's not really you're paying them to sort of protect them from you rather than paying them to protect you from other people. It's sort of, I would describe it as a kind of, extortion arrangement, really. But if you decide to go to Somalia and say, no, I don't want any bodyguards, I'm sure no one's going to kidnap you, then someone will take the opportunity to make sure that you realise that bodyguards would actually be a good idea at some point.
Well, we're going to come back because the fixers became important later on when you were actually kidnapped. But essentially you had arrived, you checked into your hotel and you found there was only, I think, one other foreigner, South African businessman there, and a couple of French
hacks, yeah.
French journalists.
Yeah.
Do you not get a sense of foreboding that perhaps, things might be something
slightly. One of the fixer for the French journalists, who was a Somali Belgian, had been chewing khat all night, which is the sort of amphetamine plant that people are quite fond of in Somalia. And he'd been wandering up and down the corridor most of the evening with a Kalashnikov that he'd borrowed off the guards, saying something bad is going to happen in here sometime soon. So yes, there was a slight element of paranoia in the room. But yeah, I just sort of thought he's been chewing too much and he's off his head. So we'll just ignore.
You call it psychedelic spinach in the book. I mean, it's something that everyone tucks into, isn't it? I mean, you yourself.
They're very fond of it. It's like drinking in Britain. People enjoy it a lot, and of course they don't really do it in moderation. Yeah, it's.
I'm trying to chew a whole plant.
Yes, khat. For those of you who've never tried it, and I recommend it. It's you can buy it in Wood Green and numerous other parts of London where Somalis can be found. It's a bit like, I suppose, coca leaf or something like that. You get a mild sort of amphetamine rush off it. The problem is that you have to chew. It's not just a case of chewing 1 or 2 leaves. You have to chew an entire sort of medium-sized garden shrub full of the stuff, and it tastes pretty disgusting. And by the end of the evening, after about an hour or so, you'll begin to get into it. But by the end of the evening, your sort of jaws are aching and your gums are all chewed up, and you've usually bitten your tongue open several times, and your mouth is just a mess inside. So it's not very pleasant from that point of view. That you wake up the next day unable to eat.
How did you manage to smuggle that one from the Telegraph expenses sheet?
I can't. Well, we lost all our expenses receipts, so
you got kidnapped.
It didn't matter. Yeah.
Very clever. So you're going around, you're on this kind of haze of khat leaves and sort of, people
only for one night, we weren't shooting
sorry.
Our fixers were, but
people waving guns and getting a bit paranoid. And then you went off to meet the Somali Coast Guard. I just want to mention a little bit here because it's quite intriguing. I mean, in theory, as far as I understand, the Somali Coast Guard service are supposed to be stopping piracy, but they end up suddenly getting involved in it.
They hedge their bets a little, yeah.
And it's rather intriguing. I just want to read this little passage at the beginning of the second chapter. Adiweli Aliatar's business card hinted at just how lawless Puntland's coastline was. A printed logo introduced him as the head of the Somali Coast Guard Service, under which a series of subheadings portrayed him as a busy man: drugs, counter-terrorism, people trafficking, toxic waste dumping, illegal fishing, piracy. Rather less impressive than his business card was his ramshackle fleet of Coast Guard vessels moored at Bosasso's rundown docks. We'd gone there on our second day, this time with our full complement of 8 armed guards. They were crammed in the pickup behind us, leaning out in all directions like the anthill mob from the wacky races. At the docks, the smell of rotting fish blew on the warm air, and a sign on the gate reminded a wayward populace to refrain from bringing rifles, pistols, koshes, grenades, daggers, or CS gas.
Yeah.
So,
I'm quite worried about.
so who were these guys, and what was your encounter with them? You were trying to get to the pirates at this stage.
Yeah, well, he was the head of the Coast Guard was actually a cabbie from Toronto in Canada in his other job. He was an emigre. He like a lot of Somalis, he'd gone away, during the bad years, and then had come back with his brother and set up this Coast Guard service, which I think was originally they'd originally been in the business of fishing for sea cucumbers, and then had basically equipped a trawler or some sort of boat with an anti-aircraft gun and then bought a couple of other motor launches, and then got a contract from the government, who they had some mates with, to police the coastline. And this is sort of where some people think a lot of the piracy thing starts, because as well as sort of policing the coastline for pirates, they also were in charge of issuing fishing licenses for all the sort of the fishing fields there. And if they used to get a lot of foreign trawlers paying them for these fishing licenses, several £100,000 at the time, and if something went wrong with that agreement, they would be in the habit of, not this particular Coast Guard but others, they would be in the habit of waylaying the trawler, impounding it, and along with the crew, and then extracting a much larger, quotes, fine from whichever foreign fishing company had paid them originally. And some people think that was where people started getting the idea that basically if you impounded a ship, you could pretty much write your own check at will. Anyway, these particular guys, I think they were on the side of the angels. They were actually going out and hunting pirates down. They'd had a few gunfights and a few people had been killed. But they had also, a few years before, they stopped getting paid by the government because the government had fallen or something. There'd been some problems, and as a result, a number of their own staff had taken to piracy. So some of the boats that they were supposed to be escorting through the dangerous part of the waters, the so-called Coast Guard had arrested them and or sort of waylaid them, and then tried to negotiate ransoms, and several of them had been arrested by US warships. So yeah, it became apparent that even the law enforcement agencies were not doing a very good job there.
So you came across these guys, and then you were trying to get access to the prison to meet some real-life pirates, weren't you?
Yes, which was not terribly successful. Yeah.
What was the difficulty? Why was it so hard? I mean, because you say in the book that a lot of these guys were coming out openly saying, and were quite proud of their work.
Well, for one reason, that there is a local prison in this town, Bosasso, where we went, where they apparently had a number of pirates being held. And that was one of the reasons we thought we'd go there, because when you interview a pirate in jail, A, you know he's definitely a pirate, and B, he's not going to kidnap you. But having got to Bosasso and asked around and tried to get into the jail, they were very reluctant to let us in. We subsequently were told that they had a kind of revolving door policy where if you went in as a pirate, then you just got your clan chief to pay $20,000, and then you'd be out in a few weeks later. And then the other reason was that the conditions in the jail could have adorned an Amnesty International leaflet or something like that. It was when we finally got inside, it's just a big sort of open stockade with a pen running around the sides and just hundreds of faces staring out. Not a particularly nice jail at all. And the guards only really had kind of sort of a limited amount of control over the place. If they'd let anybody out, they would have let hundreds of them would have spilled out, and we'd have probably been, well, something unpleasant would have happened to us.
So you struggled to find your local Long John Silver, didn't you?
Yes, we did. Yes.
So what happened next?
Basically, I think we gave up at that point pretty much.
Started chewing cat leaves.
Yeah, no, not quite, no. But we got enough pirate atmosphere that we interviewed a local imam who had been preaching about the dangers of pirates to the piracy to his sort of congregation. He'd been saying, you know, to the local man, don't let your daughter marry a pirate. It's worse than sleeping with her yourself, which is an unusual.
Like a journalist, then. Isn't it?
Yeah, an unusual kind of way of putting it. But anyway, so we had enough, and then yeah, we then had about another 3 days before the flight.
You were supposed to head out next week, mid next week, and you were still trying to get to some pirates.
Yes, but it was proving difficult. The one pirate that the fixer offered to introduce us, he said by way of recommendation, oh yes, this guy kidnapped a French journalist last year. He'd be great for you to interview. And we sort of thought, not.
You could have gone on.
Really.
You could have got kidnapped earlier.
Yes, probably. Yeah.
So you were struggling to get pirates, and you were basically, essentially, on your way out, weren't you? And then you decided quite late in the day to swap your bodyguards on the way to the airport, didn't you?
Yeah, just because we were fed up with the lot we had. They, funnily enough, if you have 8 armed men who are escorting you around, if you sort of try to start bossing them about and they say no, there's not an awful lot you can do. So we were sort of saying, like, you know, well, we want you to turn up at 8 in the morning and work till 4, rather than turning up at 11:30 and working till 2. And they just like, well, yeah. So yeah. So on the last day, we were anxious about getting to the airport on time, and we realised also that they might figure that they might realise we had to get there at a certain time and start, you know, messing us about to extract more money out of us. So we told the fixer and translator to swap for a different bunch, which was useful from their point of view, as it turned out.
So you're on your way to the airport, and your own bodyguards kidnap you, basically.
Yes, this is on the last day. We're driving from our hotel to the airport, thinking, thank God we're getting out of here finally, after a 3-day wait. And we were in one truck, or a four-wheel drive, and then the bodyguards were in a pickup truck behind us, 7 of them or so. Different bunch of bodyguards, but we were hardly really noticing by then. And then the pickup truck suddenly zoomed in front of us and kind of pulled over, blocking the path of our SUV. And a couple of the bodyguards jumped out, and we thought, what's going on here, you know? Initially we just thought, well, maybe they're, you know, having an argument about which route to take, because the bodyguards are often quite volatile anyway, so it's not unusual to see them kind of go like that and snarling at each other and so on. And then, unfortunately, we suddenly realised they were kind of surrounding the car. At that point, they were all shouting in Somali, and we still didn't really know what was going on. And then they started opening the doors and sort of saying, right, you get out, sort of thing. And at that point, you realised, oh shit, this is it, we're getting kidnapped. And you were? We were, yes. So we then got bundled into their car, or into their pickup truck. This is still in suburban Bosasa, in a sort of open area of scrubland with, you know, houses and people not that far away, 20 yards, 30 yards away. And I remembered thinking when I worked in Iraq, if I ever get kidnapped, what I will do is I will shout and scream and cause a big commotion, because you know, these guys will not want to, if they're kidnapping you, they don't want to kill you. So, you know, you do that in a public area, then they'll maybe lose their nerve. Needless to say, when someone points a gun at you, you just kind of go, oh, yes, fine, whatever, you know. So we moved into this other car without making a slightest sound of protest, and anybody who'd seen it would have just thought we were, you know, changing a tyre in the car or something like that, sadly.
So now they whisked you off, and I want to read a little passage here, because they whisked you off to the mountains, didn't they? And I'm just going to pick up the story here. The mountains drew near. Soon we were in the foothills, coursing along a dried-up river. The pickup's tires spun their way over beds of smooth, water-washed pebbles. Finally, when the trail got too steep, we ground to a halt in front of a thicket of trees. As the guards spilled out, I counted them. 7, not the 8 we'd paid for. Fucking Ahmed and Mustafa. They'd even ripped us off on the number of kidnappers we should have had. The guards ordered us out and pointed to where the riverbed continued, up a sparsely wooded canyon. Imshi, yelled one of them. He was another teenager with a face so thin and craggy that shadows cast across it, even in the midday sun. White desert dust from the journey still covered his cheeks and forehead, transforming him into a grinning skull with black eye sockets, a Somali Jolly Roger. Imshi, I knew, meant walk in Arabic. Just in case I didn't understand, he pointed to his gun and mimed a bullet going into my forehead. Jose and I marched off, with our hands above our heads. Mafi mushkile, I said. It was Arabic for no problem, a phrase I'd learned in Iraq, mainly for use when there was in fact a very big problem indeed. We scrambled up the canyon, shoulders wincing, in expectation of a bullet. The kidnappers fanned out. A couple ahead of us, the rest behind us, guns drawn. Jose pulled alongside. Are you okay? I asked him. Me, I'm okay, yes, but I'm concerned for my parents. They'll be very worried. My father has a heart condition. I imagined some elderly Spanish man keeling over in front of the TV news and tried not to think about my own father doing the same. This man will get through this okay, I said, not really believing it. We'll just have to be strong and... Imshi, another guard, a bald, wizened guy in his 40s or 50s, interrupted us, pointing a finger to his lips. 10 minutes further up, we came to a clearing and stopped. They gathered around us, guns drawn. A new fear hit me. What if they were just going to kill us? Just as I was thinking what a discreet, soundproofed spot this would be to shoot us and hide our bodies, one of them delved into a rucksack and handed us a bottle of mineral water. They obviously planned to keep us alive. For now, anyway. So now you're up in the mountains outside of the town.
Yeah. You
didn't really know exactly, obviously, where you were. What happened from there?
Well, this was about 2 hours in. The mountain range near Bosaso, I don't even know what its name is to this day. It's a very obscure area. I didn't even know Somalia had any mountains before I went there. But it's a very, very empty area. There are no pathways, literally no inhabitation at all. You maybe see one goat herd passing you every 24 hours as we were walking through this area. We were then marched up through into these mountains. I had the going was very, very difficult. It was just literally jumping from rock to rock, and I had only a pair of these Next slip-on shoes on, which was not the ideal footwear for it. Basically, for the next 48 hours, we were just sort of marched almost solid, except for a couple of breaks at night to lie down on, we did consider escaping. Once or twice. I mean, you get so desperate, you just think, like, God's sake, anything to get out of here. As it got dark, we suddenly found it was beginning to get quite hard to see, and we did think, well, like, there's only one guard ahead of us now. The rest have fallen back behind us. They've obviously relaxed a bit. If we wander up behind this guy in front of us and either hit him on the head with a rock or push him over or something like that, and then run off down that slope there, then if we can get 50 yards ahead of them, they won't be able to see us because it's dark, and then perhaps we can get enough distance that they'll just panic, and then we'll be then they'll give up or something like that, and then we'll be able to find our way to safety. The problem with that is, A, we didn't know what was over the slope. It might have been just a huge big cliff, and B, this area was very, very remote. We were at least 20 or 30 miles from the nearest town, and it was the dry season, so there were no ponds or streams anywhere. You could see where all the water courseways were dried up, and also it was just a maze of twisting valleys. It was impossible to get any real bearings on where you were in relation to the coastline or anything like that. And so we realised, really, even if the guys had just let us go at that point and not been chasing us, which they obviously would have done, we'd have probably ended up just wandering around in circles and probably dying of thirst. So at that point we decided that escaping wasn't a very good idea. Plus we would have got a kicking as well, in most likelihood, if we'd tried it and they'd caught us, which they probably would have done, which I equally didn't fancy.
So your temporary home became a cave, didn't it?
Yes, after about two days of walking pretty much non-stop, they we finally arrived at this cave in a sort of down a mountain sort of canyon, tucked away in the middle of nowhere, and it was a very, very remote spot by then, and we realised there was literally no way that anybody was going to find you, and I half expected to see Bin Laden sort of standing up to greet, hello, you know. It's a great hiding place here, you know. It was,
got to smoke him out.
Yeah, but at that point, having walked for sort of the best part of 2.5 days, and at one point, you know, getting really, really quite severely dehydrated, it was nice just to be sitting down doing nothing really. So it was almost like, oh, you know, thank God, you know.
Time for cave painting.
Yes, etc. Yeah.
So you were there, and so the days rumbled on, and then eventually you got a chance to make a phone call, didn't you?
Yes, on about day 5, they took us up to the top of this mountain, and one of them managed to get a mobile phone reception. Bizarrely, you could get mobile phone reception at the top of these mountains. Somalia, contrary to what you may think, that Somalia is a great businessman, and they actually have one of the most efficient mobile phone networks in the world. It's very cheap. I wouldn't say the reception's great, but you can get, you know, surprisingly good coverage there. So they then rang a number on the phone, and then passed it to me, and this man answered the phone saying, "Hello, my name is Ali. I am a school teacher from Bosaso, which is the local town. I am acting in a humanitarian capacity. Do you understand? I may be able to help you." And I sort of thought, well, I'm not sure you're necessarily acting in a humanitarian capacity here. But anyway, he introduced himself as a sort of intermediary between ourselves and whoever we wanted to get in touch with in London. And he said, "Is there anybody you want to call? Or is there anybody you want me to call for you?" And I said, "Can you ring the office my office in London, please, because I expect they will be waiting to hear from me." I didn't want to ring my parents or my girlfriend or anybody direct for 2 reasons. One, the shock of hearing me, I think, would not have been pleasant for them, and the other, they'd probably have their phones switched off. So, whereas the office, I anticipated I hoped would have somebody waiting for us to call.
But it was a Sunday morning, wasn't it?
It was a Sunday
morning.
Sunday
paper, no one's.
Yeah, and there weren't that many people around. What this guy did was he then rang the number I'd given him on another mobile, and then putting them both on speakerphone, he so it was one speakerphone speaking to another, which is not a great way of connecting. And then rang the news desk, which on a Sunday morning is staffed by the Daily Telegraph's news desk, because the Sunday paper doesn't work on that day. They've usually got a skeleton staff in then, and I know, having worked that shift myself, if you get all kinds of nutcases ringing up at that point, you know, people claiming to be Prince Charles, or, you know, people claiming that Tony Blair is a Mason and they need to
saying they've been kidnapped.
Come in, yeah, or just saying, yeah, I'm Ali from Somalia. I'd like to speak to somebody from the Sunday Telegraph, please. And I was waiting for the moment when they said, "I'm sorry, you know, there's no one here today. Can you call back?"
Kind of what happened. The woman picked it up and said, "Oh, sorry."
Well, yeah,
someone
did initially answer and sort of say, "I'm sorry. What are you saying?" And I was just, oh God, you know. Luckily, she then passed me on to somebody else, who then realised what was going on. To cut a long story short, and
they didn't put you up the copy taker.
They didn't sort of say, "Oh, where have you been? You know, what you know, sort of what we've been waiting to hear from you for ages." You know, they did know that what had happened. So anyway, they then gave a number for one of my colleagues, who had been appointed as a sort of liaison man, as it were, and he had a mobile number that was switched on 24 hours. So I then rang him and told him what had happened, and he then had, as is customary in these cases, he had a number of proof of life questions. You know, like, what's your favourite holiday destination, so on. You know, who was your first teacher at school, and so on. So at that point, we were able to get proof of life, as they called it, back, which was a great relief to my family, and in particular my girlfriend, who had spent the first 5 days thinking that I was probably dead, because at that point they really didn't know what happened. They thought they were fairly sure we'd been kidnapped, but they didn't know where we'd been taken or by whom. And in her mind, she just suddenly thought, well, the longer it goes on that we don't hear from him, the more chance there is that something went wrong. You know, who's to say that, you know, he tried to escape or something and didn't just get shot and he's lying in a gutter or somewhere in a valley in those mountains and we'll just never find out. That was the sort of nightmare scenario that was going through her mind. Luckily, at that moment, you know, everything sort of began to click into place a bit.
So except for these occasional phone calls, it was the kind of monotony of cave life, really, wasn't there? Lots of discussion about bowel movements and
yes, all that sort of thing, yeah.
And football teams and so on. Tell me, you know, did you feel stressed, strained? How was your relationship with Jose? How did that hold up?
Well, we got on surprisingly well together. Initially, because I'd only worked with the guy for a week, we had quite a good week together, and then we chewed khat on the last night and drunk lots of Ethiopian gin and generally enjoyed ourselves. There's a when we actually got driven away, I remember suddenly thinking, oh God, you know, I mean, I invited this guy on this trip, you know, and now he's getting kidnapped. What is he going to say? You know, am I going to get an earful from him at any minute? You know,
you're quite decent about it.
Yeah, you're also thinking like, you know, what is this guy going to be like to be held with? Is he going to be sensible, or is he going to go nuts at some point with worry, or is he going to try and fight these people or do things that is going to make life more difficult? Luckily, he had pretty much the same attitude as me, which was just sort of try and take it easy and, you know, just be calm and try and keep a bit of a sense of humour about what's going on and look on the bright side. And so we were fortunate in that we both got on very well together. And actually, within that first week, when it felt pretty grim, we began to sort of bond together a bit, and you know, that was one thing that kept us going, was that you feel this sort of friendship developing with somebody sort of, I suppose, like 100 times the rate that you would normally develop a friendship with someone, because you're in proximity with them all the time. You end up talking about all sorts of things, you know, like your life. You tell each other your life story, you know, in case you never have a chance to tell it again. Yeah. You feel a bit like a sort of soul waiting in the waiting room before the afterlife, and you think, right, well, you know, what should we talk about? I want to tell you my life story about how I got here and why it may all end up, you know, as a mess now. And you learn all sorts of things, you know, sort of details of each other's sex lives and how many girlfriends you've had and what your favourite rock groups are and all that sort of thing.
Did that keep you going for long? Talk about sex?
The sex bit, no, the rock groups bit longer, yeah. So we were lucky in the sense that we got on pretty well together, and yeah, we're still good friends now.
And you also got to know your kidnappers, didn't you? Developed nicknames for them all. Who were these guys?
Well, we had a number of them. There was the chap who first tried to put a bullet, or threatened to put a bullet in my forehead, Skullface, as you mentioned earlier. He was actually quite a nice guy, that one incident aside.
That's one way to get to know someone, isn't it?
They were mainly young guys, of, you know, probably about between the age of 17 and 20 or something. For the first couple of days, they didn't really say anything when they were frog marching us across these mountains, and they didn't speak much English, but they did speak a smattering of Arabic, and I have a smattering of Arabic as well. So the first conversation we had with them was about football, and one of them said to me, "Where are you from?" in Arabic, and I said, "I'm from England," or from Britain, wondering whether it was the right thing to say, because thinking if these guys are Al-Qaeda or something, then, you know, if they know I'm from Britain, that's not going to look good. But it's on my passport anyway, which I forgot, so be it. And instead, his face suddenly lit up, and he said, Britain, Manchester United, Liverpool, Paul Scholes, you know, in this kind of very, you know, excited voice. And I said, yes. And they teach you, you know, if you ever go on these hostile environment courses, to sort of develop a kind of relationship with your kidnappers. So we tried to push. Unfortunately, I don't really know anything about football. So I said, yes, Thierry Henry, Arsenal. And he looked a bit like that. And I thought, oh God, what have I said, you know? And then Jose, my colleague, said, no, Thierry Henry transferred to Barcelona last year, and you just got it wrong. And yeah, clearly this guy knew more about the Premier League transfer market than I did. And that was quite weird, because I mean we all know that the international language of football is spoken everywhere, but to have it spoken in the mountains of Somalia by a group of kidnappers is quite strange. So from that point we broke the ice with them a bit, but the conversations never really went much beyond the sort of, you know, Arsenal, Paul Scholes, David Beckham, that sort of thing. I mean we did a similar thing with politicians, you know, sort of Barack Obama, George Bush, Robert Mugabe and so on, but it was sad in a way, because if one of them had spoken good English, you know, we'd have been able to get hopefully a lot more sort of insight into what they were doing and so on. But I have a feeling that yes, it would have done. Yes, I have a feeling that they, even if they had done, they were probably wary of telling us an awful lot about what they did anyway.
Well, one of the guys you nicknamed Old Bastard, he was the older one, wasn't he?
Yes.
And there's a little section I want to read here, because there was obviously the monotony of life, but there were some very hairy moments. Among them, there was a gun battle at the cave.
Yes.
And then there was another time when you're about to have another phone call. I just want to read a little section here. A few days later, we were summoned up the mountainside for yet another phone session back to London. As we scrambled up the slope, we noticed the old bastard sat beside Yusuf and the others, fixing us with his usual stare. It looked ominous. He didn't usually sit in on the phone calls. As Yusuf tried to reach Ali on the phone, the old bastard got to his feet, brandishing his Kalashnikov with a flourish. Then he pointed it at me, muttering angrily, and gestured that I came and sit right in front of him. Oh my God, what was he doing? The old bastard ratcheted back the slide of his weapon, its banana-shaped magazine glinting in the sun. The Kalashnikov is a great weapon for theatrics. Its cocking mechanism involves a series of distinctive gear crunches, ideal for any bully who wants to gradually up the ante. Whether there was a live round in the chamber or not, I had no idea. But if I wasn't about to face a real execution, I was either in for a mock one or for a beating with a barrel. Just ignore him, man, muttered Jose, not looking up. I sat where I was, gazing out across the valley, as if I hadn't even noticed the snarling loon waving a gun in my face. If he was going to beat my head in, there wasn't much I could do, but I wasn't going to sit in front of him to make it any easier. He gestured again. Come on, man, be strong. Don't piss your pants. This guy is just trying to frighten you. I turned my eyes to the rest of the gang. They were sniggering nervously, like a bunch of kids watching a school bully. Then, just as I was bracing myself for a blow across the face, Skullface 2 and the smoker got to their feet and said something to the old bastard. He snarled back, pointed angrily at me, then a scuffle broke out as they tried to grab his gun from him. Others joined in and started dragging him off down the slope. As they disappeared around a corner, 2 gunshots rang out, the echo journeying back and forth across the valley. Christ, has he shot them, or have they shot him?
Yeah.
They hadn't actually shot them.
No, sadly no. They had this, as you heard there was this one particular guy who seemed intent on beating us up at that particular occasion. The rest of him dragged him off, and then we heard some shots around the corner. Didn't know what was going on, and then saw him getting led off with his hands tied behind his back down to the cave where we were, and I didn't really know what was going on. We hoped that maybe he had gone a bit too far and they were going to, you know, just keep him tied up for the rest of the time, because this was this one particular guy who was giving us quite a hard time. Unfortunately, when we got back to the cave, he was there sat laughing and joking with them all, so we thought, what on earth is going on? We think he was basically just, his purpose was to sort of try and frighten the life out of us and give us the impression that, you know, he was getting really fed up with keeping us there all that time. I felt very nervous, especially when we saw that particular guy. The moment he came into view at any time in the camp, I was like, oh God, you know. Yeah, you just imagine that, you know, sooner or later they're going to start torturing you if they want.
But you held on to your fingers in the end.
We did, yes.
And your limbs. So time went on, didn't it? And you ratcheted up 30, and then it came to about 40 days in, didn't it?
40 days in total, yeah.
What happened then?
Well, after extensive sort of phone calls back and forth and so on and so forth, and a number of false starts, we eventually told you getting released. It happened once or twice before, and then nothing, nothing had come of it. And then there'd actually been an argument in between different factions within the gang as to whether to release us or not. And the faction who were against releasing us eventually seemed to win that argument, and they were saying, we're going to keep you here for another year if we want, And I was just, oh God, and we felt we'd managed up to that point, up to the 40 days, but really we were getting pretty ragged by then. You're just sort of sitting around staring at the space a lot of the time, run out of things to say to Jose, and when you get in that state of just waking up in the morning and just looking at the cave wall, that's the point where it really starts to become quite debilitating, because there's just no purpose left to your life at all, and you are beginning to think, at what point do I start going funny in the head? It's bound to happen pretty much sooner or later, just all this enforced idleness. And you begin to run out of things to think about as well. You try and think of things to comfort yourself with, or to busy your mind. And after a while, you think, oh, I've thought about that, and it's quite a sort of frightening how quickly your brain empties of meaningful thoughts.
Brilliant jokes that you were told.
Yeah, it's frightening how quickly my brain emptied of meaningful thoughts. Other people may have been slightly better. Then luckily, another phone call came through, and all of a sudden the whole choreography was very different, and suddenly they said, right, we're going to release you. And we had instructions from an intermediary in London saying, look, these guys are going to take you off and you're going to be released to a bunch of clan elders tomorrow morning. Sure enough, the next day we set off with a small army of kidnappers this time, not just the gang who'd nicked us, but about 40 or 50 guys who turned up with sort of RPGs and
trying to get a bit of reflected glory over.
Yes, and in a convoy of technicals, which are these trucks with machine guns mounted on them. We drove up to the top of this mountain top over a mountain pass, and then they stopped there. We could see these three vehicles where these intermediaries were down below, and they then sort of marched us down there and basically handed us over. At which point I sort of turned to the leader of the gang, who was this guy. Was actually, I sort of had a sort of sneaking respect for him, because he was very sort of strong and steady, and sort of big bloke, built like a bouncer, and he was quite the sort of warrior. And one half of me sort of thought, well, what do you say to someone when when they kidnap you for all this time? Do you congratulate them on their relative professionalism? Thank them for the fact that they haven't tortured you, and that apart from the gunfight in the cave that afternoon, and the odd bit of threats and so on, it's generally been not too bad.
Thanks for the digestive.
By the sort of general standard of things, the cooking was okay, etc. Or do you just kind of tell them to fuck off and risk kind of a gunfight, or do you just walk away and ignore him and pretend? I wondered what I was going to do if he offered to shake my hand, and as it happened, he had absolutely no interest in sort of exchanging any kind of pleasantries with me. He was far too worried about being in the middle of a police trap of some sort during this handover moment. So we turned our back on each other, and that was that.
So you didn't make your Christmas card list?
No. Well, Christmas had already passed. Christmas, my birthday, and New Year, all in this 6 weeks, all fell in within that sort of little period of time.
Lots to celebrate.
Yeah, and then we were handed over to these intermediaries, who were basically just a bunch of old grandpas, really, as far as I could tell, elderly men in suits and trainers, and they said, hello, welcome, you're free, get into these cars. And that was sort of the point at which we thought we were pretty much finally home. They then unfortunately had an argument between themselves, and one of them pulled a gun on the other, and had to be sort of physically restrained, and we were sort of sitting in the car going, oh God, what's going on now, thinking this is some diversionary tactic so that we're going to get kidnapped again. And luckily the leader who pulled this gun off, he just sort of smiled at us. He said, oh, don't worry, it's just the way that guy is, he's just trying to make his point. So then we were driven home into a plane, and then we were out of Somalia within about an hour after that, and that was it. Apart from a press conference with some Somali journalists that they made us do, just as a way of saying thank you to the Somali authorities for their efforts in trying to get us released, where two or three guys from the local news agency turned up, Somali guys, and they said, so how long were you kidnapped for? I said 40 days. And they said, were you tortured at all? I said no. And then you could see that the sort of look of interest just went like that straight away. I've been through that. I know that
walking with all the digits, and they thought.
From doing many press conferences myself, they completely lost interest after that. Asked a couple more questions and then left.
So, you know, a great homecoming. Welcome back to the windswept Isles of Britain. Mm-hmm. How was that?
It was very nice. There'd been a news blackout while we'd been away, much to the sadness of the publisher of my previous book, who had hoped that it would generate decent level of publicity every day of the week. So we didn't. I was kind of wondering whether there would be loads of sort of cameras and stuff at the airport, but there was.
That was part of the negotiation thing, wasn't it? The Telegraph asked people.
The Telegraph asked other media outlets not to report it. Yeah.
Which you now regret. Because it could have been good for the book.
No, I think it was a useful thing at the time, which is something we can discuss later. But yeah, so I came back. There was no great fame for me really, other than my sister's daughter had done a school project on somebody who was famous, and she was going to do Barack Obama, but she decided he was boring, so she did me instead.
Whereas, never been kidnapped.
Yeah, Jose, my co-colleague, my co-hostage, the reporting ban had not applied in Spain, so he returned as sort of the new Brian Keaton. He was hugely famous, really? And
all bearded
yes,
and
yeah. Yes, enjoyed many sort of media and romantic opportunities as a result.
Well, lucky your partner's not here tonight. So, of course, everyone's intrigued by how these things work, but and ransoms and so on. But that's a slightly difficult subject, isn't it? That's why I'm asking about it.
Yeah, I mean, we have an idea of who did it, our kidnapping, and why, which is hinted at in the book, but not too much, partly for legal reasons, because we can't accuse certain people of having conducted a kidnapping. So there is a limit to what I can say on that. Also, the general policy with newspapers and anything else in terms of discussing aspects of your personal security and how certain situations may be resolved is generally never to really comment about them. So that's kind of up for other people to sort of guess at, really, unfortunately, which is not much of an answer, I know, but sadly that is not something that one will get a huge amount of insight on in reading the book, I'm afraid.
I'm going to, in a moment, throw it open to the floor, because I'm sure there's lots of questions about your extraordinary story. But one thing, obviously, that people think about is that it must have been a very traumatic experience. And I was asked the other day, what do journalists do after these things? And I said, well, generally they tend to sort of drink themselves into submission and do lots of bad disco dancing. I mean, how do you deal with this?
I got drunk for a couple of nights, but generally I had to, when I, more or less as soon as I got released, the paper were on the phone asking for copy about what happened. Not quite literally that, well, yes, literally that day. They basically said, can we have it was a Sunday, which is not a great day to get released from the point of view of the Sunday Telegraph, because everybody else had several days to report on the fact of the release, but they said, can you write a big thing for next Sunday, sort of 5,000 word piece on how it all happened and so on and so forth. So I said, fine, yeah, I'll do that. And then they said, oh, actually, can you also do another one for Tuesday, just to sort of like the moment of your captivity? I said, yeah, all right, we'll do that. And and by the way, can you do just something for the web now, yeah, before you get back on the plane? So I duly did all this, and while that may sound like quite a demanding office, it is part of your profession as a journalist, unless you're, if you're in a reasonable kind of state of mind to file come what may, whatever the circumstances are. And it's also quite good therapy, not so much from the point of view of being cathartic and letting it all these dreadful thoughts in your head come out, more just the idea of I'd had 6 weeks of other people doing things for me. Here was something I could finally do for myself, and to give the paper a decent show, which was a way of paying them back for all the grim weeks that half a dozen of my colleagues, probably more than that, had spent working almost full time to get me out, and all the equally grim time for everybody else who was having to cover for them and doing shift work over the over the Christmas period and so on. I mean, you know, as the person who's been through it, you sort of get the glory, as it were, when it all works out right. But for everybody else, it was not much fun at all. You know, they spent a lot of time just, you know, morning till night, trying every single possible avenue they could to find people who could, you know, pull strings to get us released. There was a lot of pressure on them to do all that, and you know, at the end of the day, if you work as a foreign correspondent, which is what I do, you're paid to go to these places and come back intact, not to get kidnapped. So a big adventure though is it's not really the way you're supposed to do things, and my sense of professional pride was a bit smarting by the time I got out. So.
But I mean, it has become increasingly risky, hasn't it, our kind of work? I mean, just this year, 3 friends, colleagues have been killed in Libya, photographers, you know, people have been killed in Somalia before. At what point do you decide, is it worth the risk? At what point do you decide, well, we can't really keep going to places like Somalia unless things change?
Well,
I mean, do you think it's important to keep covering this story?
Well, I mean, the standard answer to all these things is that if you only went, if you didn't take any risks at all, nobody would do anything other than embedded reporting from places like Iraq or Afghanistan. I'm not knocking embedded reporting. I've done lots of it, and my own opinion is that it's often the only way to get to certain places, and often, certainly with the Americans especially, they let you off on a pretty loose leash anyway, and you get to meet tribal elders or whoever. You know, they do quite a lot of community affairs stuff. They're not just going out shooting people, so you do get to meet the people that, you know, on the ground, the Afghans or the Iraqis or whatever. But you know, obviously I won't be going back to Somalia for a long time, not while I feel that the risks of getting kidnapped are so high. Part of the problem there is that so few people go there. You stand out like a sore thumb when you arrive. But I think, you know, an element of risk is always going to be, you know, part of the job, and to some extent, I think it's what appeals to people in a world where we have an increasing sense of health and safety obligations and insurance obligations preventing anybody doing anything remotely risky in Britain. It is a chance to sort of toss a lot of that aside, in a sense, and it gives you a sense of adventure that people don't always get in their ordinary lives that much these days.
A lot of people would say, well, I'm going to Somalia because I want to bear witness to the suffering and, you know, so on and so forth. But then, of course, a lot of the coverage of Somalia is seen by Somalia as being very negative, perhaps not surprisingly given what's happened to you. I mean, how do you report these stories and still give a sense that there might be some people who can bring the country back together and give it a...
Well, I mean, there is obviously all the grimness and so on, and there's no point in sweeping that under the carpet when it's somewhere like Somalia. I don't think there is an awful lot to be happy about. You know, there are other stories where the balance is a bit more, you know, there are good sides and bad sides. But I mean, we did a story recently, the mayor of Mogadishu, who is a Somali from Camden. He used to work for Camden Council, and he is now trying to regenerate Mogadishu based on the King's Cross regeneration model, and his view is that if you can regenerate King's Cross, you can regenerate anywhere. And he's a very cheerful chap, and you know, he is someone who you can tell the story of that country through, you know, also with a British connection, and you can sort of show the challenges he's up against. I mean, he put on a music festival that was attacked by loads of people, and 5 people got killed, including the band leader of the leader of the band that was playing music at this festival. But you know, people like that, they exude hope and so on. I mean, whether he will really succeed or not, I don't know. But that is a way of trying to sort of paint a slightly brighter picture. My personal sense is that endless stories about, you know, I mean, we've got more of them coming at the moment about the famines and so on. Terrible though they are, I'm not sure that the general public pay that much attention anymore, because they've heard it 100 times in the last 20 years from different countries. And if one is being cynical, I think a lot of it just washes over people's heads.
Well, you mentioned the general public and people's views. That's a good chance, I think, to go to the audience and to hear some questions about your experience and about Somalia. Can we take some questions from... Don't be shy.
Hello, I'd just like to ask you, is there any country or place that you really wouldn't want to go to?
No, I think they're all fascinating in their own way. I wouldn't want to go back to Somalia at the moment. I'm not sure they'd have me back actually with my record. I think it might be difficult to get a visa. But I don't think there's any particular place that is other than Somalia. I don't think there's anywhere really that is that dangerous at the moment that you wouldn't want to go to anyway. I mean, the ones that everybody wants to go to are like Syria and Yemen, that unfortunately they are effectively off limits because it's impossible to get a visa. But no, there's nowhere I wouldn't want to go to.
As a young chap, yeah.
Do you know whether the people who kidnapped you, are they professional kidnappers, or is it just a sort of opportunism thing, or?
They certainly seem pretty professional, in the sense of when they actually did the kidnapping and they grabbed us out of this car and then stuck us in their own pickup truck, they whizzed off across this, desert like this, which is just a very rough desert road, really just winding through sand dunes. And this guy was driving like a rally driver, a professional getaway driver in a bank job or something. And then when they were driving us over the hills, they were very good at that. You had the sense of them acting like a little military unit. One or two of them would run off ahead as scouts, and then they would come back and they would confer in very low voices. And throughout the time we were actually in the cave, what was noticeable was that they never argued with each other. There was just one incident with a gunfight, but that was with two people from outside of their immediate group. But there was never an argument of any sort, really. And this is about 25 guys all together, because they were joined by others, working shifts round the clock to guard us at the camp, and then also to keep lookouts in the surrounding area. Quite a stressful situation for them, because if they got caught, they could have got killed, sent to prison, whatever. And yet, not once did I hear any raised voices between them. You'd expect them to be arguing about who was doing the cooking that night, or who had or hadn't made the tea or whatever. Not a thing. We speculate that might be because they were all from the same clan or something, and perhaps there was a sort of natural sort of consensus going on there. But I know that some Somalis in the audience here tonight, I think they probably might know better than me on that. But it was odd. You would imagine if you going backpacking on holiday with your missus and sort of half a dozen other people, and after a fortnight you're thinking like, I'd never want to see that person again. Here's a bunch of guys doing a mission in the mountains, and much more stressful situation. But no, they did seem quite professional, and they didn't chew khat at all. I don't know if some of you saw the thing on the website. That was my publicist getting slightly carried away with. They didn't actually chew khat on any occasion when we were with them, which again is a sense that there was a degree of discipline operating there. So yes, I think they were fairly. They also spent a lot of time reading the Quran, which was slightly worrying from our point of view at the start. But they did not behave like typical pirates, although we were told that they were actually freelancing pirates, and that they'd normally been, if they hadn't been doing us, they'd have been doing a job sort of out at sea. Whether that's true or not, I don't really know.
But you're concerned about the Quran being what?
When we initially heard them reading the Quran, we thought, oh God, we're in the hands of some Al-Qaeda people, because it wasn't the kind of behaviour that I would have associated as typical of pirates. Pirates tend to be more sort of wayward, ruffianly types, who are occasionally fond of drinking and chewing khat and so on and so forth. As it turned out, they were not Al-Qaeda. We did ask him one day, so what do you think about Al-Qaeda then? So, good or bad? And they went, no, crazy, which was a great relief.
There was another telltale sign that they were quite professionals, because they had a rations of Mars bars ready, didn't they?
They did, yes. They had. We were fed reasonably well. They had rations of Mars bars, no marathon bars, Snickers, as I know, yeah. One or two of them were delegated to cook all the time, so we had an endless diet of goat stew and goat spaghetti, which I must admit became quite monotonous after not very long. Trying to eat spaghetti with your hands is quite difficult as well. So like that.
Some more questions, please.
In terms of the pirate narrative and following that up and going to the prison and trying to work out where it was all coming from, in terms of history, could you talk a little bit about that transition from possible fishermen to pirates and the skills that some of these guys have to actually get onto these big boats and where those skills came from?
Yeah, sure. The commonly held narrative is that back in about sometime in the 90s, the fishermen, there's a lot of sort of artisan fishermen in Somalia who make a living just, in little wooden boats going out to sea to fish in what are very, very rich fishing grounds, as it happens. And that after the government collapsed in 1991, a lot of foreign vessels realised that these waters were unpoliced, and so they would come and basically poach the fish. These would be vessels from Europe and also China and India and elsewhere. And that the Somali fishermen got fed up with that and began to waylay some of these foreign vessels and board them, and I started out just robbing them or extracting a fine, as they would put, and then that moved on to actually holding them for ransom. So I've lost my chain of thought slightly. It quickly became quite clear, though, that those who were the number of poachers in relation to the number of hijackings soon was very quickly outweighed, and a lot of the people who were doing the hijackings had never been fishermen in the first place. In terms of where they learnt their skills, because boarding a big a foreign trawler, or certainly a big foreign oil tanker or something, is not an easy task. These boats can move at 25 miles an hour, and they'll often have a deck that is maybe 20 or 30 feet high. So what the pirates do is they use grappling ladders, 12 or 15 feet long, and their speedboats, their little wooden speedboats, have to basically get up quite close to the boat and then hoist a grappling ladder on top, and then they climb up. Those are kind of maritime skills that you probably wouldn't learn that quickly if you hadn't been taught. And the theory is that the Coast Guard guys we mentioned earlier, they had been trained by a British company called Khat Security way back in the late 90s, which had a legitimate contract to train the Coast Guard, but because they were training them in anti-piracy techniques, the theory is that some of these Coast Guard guys who'd been drilled in anti-piracy techniques basically were gamekeepers turned poachers, and when the contract that the company had to train them ran out, and there was no money to pay for them anymore, a lot of these guys then went into the pirate gangs and dispersed some of their knowledge, either working themselves or passing it on. But this is all supposition. There is no real definite story or narrative on exactly what happened when. Does that answer your question? Or yeah.
Some more questions.
Were you aware of any potential rescue attempts at all, or do you think
yes.
a rescue might have been successful, or negotiation was the only way?
There was one early on, allegedly, on about day 4. My parents got a call to say that I think they got a call, or certainly the office got a call to say that Bosaso police were on the case and that they had surrounded the hideout. The office then Googled Bosaso police and found this picture of this kind of ragtag-looking militia with loads of blokes with big glasses and RPGs and so on. I thought, this lot do not look like they may be capable of a precision SAS-style raid. There was a chance that this could end up in a bloodbath. So they then frantically rang the authorities in Bosaso and said, please, for God's sake, don't carry out this raid. They said, oh, no, we have we have this cave surrounded, you know, we're going to be going in, it'll all be over in 3 hours time or whatever. After an afternoon of very stressful negotiations, it turned out that they were in fact nowhere near the cave and that they had no idea where these people were at all. But that was, I think, the one rescue attempt that was made. I mention it to give you an idea of how stressful it was for the poor people in my office who were trying to sort of control events, because I don't think there's much doubt if the Bosaso police had gone in, there would have been a very high chance of somebody getting killed. If not Jose Arai, then one of the kidnappers. And I must say, from a personal point of view, I would not really have liked, even for one of the kidnappers, to have died. I mean, much as I didn't like one or two of them, the prospect of walking out of there with somebody else's blood on your hands, in a loose sense, would not have been very pleasant at all.
Did you and Jose talk about being rescued and whether you was something you were in favour of?
Yeah, I mean, that sentiment that I've just expressed, I must admit, was at the beginning. By the end, I was beginning to think, like, yeah, it'd be quite nice if the SAS turned up and if they blew a few people's heads off. I don't really give a shit anymore. You know, your mind sort of becomes slightly less sympathetic as time goes on. But I mean, where we were, it was a very, very isolated area. I don't really know how special forces people work, but I think they would have had their work cut out trying to get anywhere near, because the moment they parachuted in or something like that, even if they were 20 miles away or something like that, somebody would have seen them, and the sight of lots of, you know, armed men from a Western army wandering into this area, even if they were in disguise, would have rung alarm bells. And you know, as I say, our guys used to sort of do stag duty all over the surrounding area, probably even right down to the nearest village, probably just having somebody watching to see if anything went on. So we really didn't have much hope of anybody trying to...
Snicker wrappers might have been a giveaway.
Yeah. But no, we didn't really have any hope of anybody coming to rescue us, sadly. But there was, to some extent, that was probably a relief.
More questions, please.
Could you tell me what you think the effect of creating a stronger deterrent to piracy would be? I mean, sort of arming boats, you know, cargo ships and stuff.
Yeah, well, I mean, there are a number of in the last few years, the piracy has got worse. Basically, the consensus is that the foreign navies have not really been able to have that much effect. If anything, all they've done is displace it, so that the pirates are now roaming much further afield, and the hijackings are still going on and so on. There are a number of schools of thought. One is to arm each ship with guys with guns, and certainly if you're on a ship armed, it's quite hard for a bunch of people in a boat to come and sort of grab hold of you, especially if you have professional security guards. The downside of that is it complicates your insurance an awful lot. Insurers have to factor in things like, about, well, what if one of our guys accidentally shot somebody who wasn't a pirate but just a fisherman? Where would we be in terms of our indemnities? You know, how do we arrange for safe storage of these guns? All that sort of thing is immensely more complicated than it might immediately look. So that is being considered as an option in some cases, but not in others, although I think people are increasingly coming around to that idea. The other, though, is, and this is the more controversial one, is just for the navies to take a much tougher line on what's going on. You've probably read here and there of stories which are mostly true, about European navies arresting pirates and then just dumping them on the Somali seashore or letting them go. Obviously that doesn't really go down very well with the public here. The reason they do that mostly is because they just don't have, there are no jails to prosecute them. In Kenya runs a few, but they're already pretty full. And also, you know, if you've caught a bunch of pirates in the northern Puntland coast, it's a 1,500-mile journey down to Mombasa, where the main courts are, to dump the guys off, and then they have to have a fair, you know, a right to a trial and so on. You've got to prosecute people, provide witnesses. It's a complex procedure. What the Russians and the Indians have started doing, informally, basically is taking a much tougher line and really finding pirate ships, especially pirate motherships. And there's been a few instances where the Indian Navy, for example, has gone on board and just basically gone in with guns blazing and killed a number of hostages in the process, but also killed or arrested a number of pirates. And there are those within the industry, the shipping industry, who sort of say, well, really, that is the only way to go with this. You've really got to show a pretty tough example to these people because they are pretty desperate. The threat of jail sentences, even if they were much more likely than they are, is simply not sufficient to people who are already living in a kind of pretty much, a life and death life in Somalia anyway. So you've really just got to, give them the idea that taking to sea as a pirate is going to mean almost certain death. And that means making a few very bloody examples, really. My sort of reading of it is that that's being left to some of these navies from countries like India and Russia who have, perhaps, shall we say, slightly less concern for the human rights of the pirates and perhaps slightly less concern about losing hostages, their own hostages from their own country. To the pirates, but they'll end up doing the dirty work that will benefit everybody. Does that answer your?
There's a gentleman.
Yeah.
Sorry, it's lady here. Please.
I was just wondering if there was anything more you could say about how you were sort of let out in the negotiations, and was the Foreign Office involved or?
They were involved a bit. There were all manner of people involved. Some who we wanted to be involved and some who we didn't want to be involved. Whenever you get any hostage situation like that, and I think the case of the Chandlers, Paul and Rachel Chandler, was the same. You get all manner of people kind of offering you their services, including a lot of charlatans and fraudsters. A number of Somalis came forward saying, look, I'm the brother of one of the clansmen whose cousin is holding you or whatever, and I can probably help out here, but I will need a small fee to cover some of my expenses. £10,000 perhaps would be a start. At which point, oh God, what is really unfortunate is that some of those people do actually have influence, and any negotiating team has to actually go through the motions to a certain extent of assessing who these people are. You can't just dismiss them out of hand. But then, otherwise the office, I think they just sort of turn to anybody who they thought could help. The Foreign Office do their bit, other diplomats do their bit, sometimes journalists try and help out and so on, but it's a long and incredibly complex procedure, and for every step that goes right, several go wrong, and so.
We're running out of time here. There's various people who want to ask a question. We'll just take these last three questions. So we'll start with David.
From a medical point of view, have you had a significant psychological debriefing, and is there a special kidnapping debriefing that you go through? And have you met other people that have been kidnapped, and is there sort of like a kidnappers forum that you all
There is a bit of a club, yeah. I met Peter Moore, who is, some of you may know as being the sole surviving member of the Iraq Five, who were the four security guards and an IT worker who were kidnapped in Baghdad in 2007. The four security guards been killed, unfortunately. Peter Moore was the only survivor. He was released late last year. Sorry, in early 2010, I think. Yeah. Anyway, I met him a while back just to compare experiences. The first thing he said to me was, "How long were you kidnapped for?" He was kidnapped for 2.5 years. I said 6 weeks. He said, "Is that all?" And
a lightweight bike.
I personally didn't really suffer any problems at all afterwards. I think partly because it was just perhaps not long enough. It certainly felt like long enough at the time, but maybe I'm just not a very sort of sensitive or thoughtful person. I think he had more extensive debriefs abuse. But even he was remarkably together, despite what he had been through. But I've never had any flashbacks or anything else of any sort, except oddly for one.
2 days ago you had something.
One dream I had 2 nights ago where I dreamt I was kidnapped again in Somalia by a different bunch of people, and although the main thought that went through my mind was, shit, I'm supposed to be doing this book talk thing, in a couple of nights' time.
Luckily you made it.
Yes,
so.
that was odd, but that's the one occasion. Certainly, when I woke up from that, it was, as you know, sometimes do. You wake up from a dream and think, oh, thank God that wasn't real. But that's the only sort of psychological flashback I've had.
So a couple of nights down the pub on the Telegraph and back to work, was it?
Back to work after 3 weeks, yeah. But,
another question here from the gentleman.
Yes, my question is about, the piracy issue. You wrote about something on your book. According to Somali populations in general, the way they see...
Can you just put...
Sorry.
Mike.
The way they see piracy on, is reported, like Telegraph and other European newspapers, is very controversial, because the way they see is big nations, very powerful, taking their resources, and basically when they challenge them, they got naval forces in their territorial waters, and even the word piracy, using the word piracy in legal definition in Somali coast, it doesn't apply, because it has to happen in high seas. Somalia has got very large coastline and territorial waters. The territorial waters of Somalia is about 200 nautical miles. Most incidents, they happen in that jurisdiction. It will not qualify, according to the constitution of the law, piracy. And newspapers like yours, they're reporting piracy off the coast of Somalia. The way the Somalis see in this issue is kidnapping their own citizens and dropping, some other countries like Kenya, Maldives, and and these newspapers, they never mention about how many fishermen Somalians they were killed, and they, the whole situation you reporting and you wrote about the book is a fantasy, according to Somali people. And if you want to, for example, to go into Somalia and pursue, or find about more about, the piracy issue, you could access to the authority in Puntland and say, well,
we did meet people in the authorities in Puntland, and while you're right to say that there is an element of people being aggrieved at having had their fish stocks stolen, and no one ever gave a toss about that when that was happening, and it's only now that foreign sailors are getting taken hostage that people pay attention to it, and that there may well be issues about the legality of the jurisdictions. The fact is, these people are taking foreigners and other Somalis sometimes, and other fishermen from other pretty poor countries. The majority of the sailors who get taken hostage are Bangladeshis, Indians, not rich people at all. And it's not really, most of the people, the ministers I met in Puntland didn't really want to encourage the piracy at all. And they also made the point that when it was criminalizing an entire generation of young people who were growing up with the idea that foreigners, be they on land or elsewhere, were just basically targets to be taken, and that the only, they were getting the idea that the only way of earning any money was through piracy, which is not really something you want as a template for your young people to grow up in. In the same way as you don't want people in Colombia growing up thinking that the only way of earning money is through dealing drugs. It's an unhealthy industry to start, to even tolerate.
But is that, as he says, a genuine grievance about the plundering of fish stocks and fishermen losing their livelihoods?
To what extent that, I think that there was some problems with that in the early days. I think the number of people then jumped into...
It's not only fish stocks. The presence of foreign warships in the territorial waters of Somalia basically is illegal. And arresting Somali citizens, their own territory, the crime, I respect you, you know, and I feel sorry for you. You were kidnapped, and I respect what you say. But my point is the whole policy of the piracy of Somalia is hidden agenda towards Somalia, occupation, plundering their resources, killing the citizens of Somalia, kidnapping, and you know the media just ignores. Just, you know, it ignores, like, you know...
Well, no one's occupying Somalia. I mean,
yeah,
that's
of
part
course.
of the problem.
Foreign warships in Somali waters, what legal basis? You're talking about piracy. The Constitution of the Sea describes what piracy and what's not piracy. You now telling the audience, people are kidnapped on you, you know, on the coast, you know, in Puntland, and even you were not at sea, and you're saying they were pirates. How could you prove this? They were pirates.
Well, we were told that they were pirates operating freely. I can't prove it, no. But I'm not saying for certain sure that they are.
That's criminalizing Somali population and the whole agenda, you know, kind of like occupying, you know, criminalizing, and then you got legal rights. Do you know how many Somali citizens they were killed by the foreign warships present in Somalia?
No.
I have the records, according to the United Nations.
I know there's 62 sailors been killed, yeah. You know, I'm just saying that I'm telling you what I've heard from most Somalis I've spoken to, who say that they, you know, the piracy is not anything they want to have anything to do with, and unfortunately their own government, because they haven't really got much of one, is not capable of doing anything about it.
I think the whole thing is fantasy.
Oh well, there you go. Yeah.
So I mean, the gentleman is saying that, you know, you didn't really get to some of the roots of it, but I suppose that was difficult if you were kidnapped. I mean, just to conclude that, though, I mean, that touches on the issue we talked about before. Does your experience and what happened to you obviously gives a certain picture about what's happening there? Is it possible to really get to the roots of what's happening and find out, given the risks there are for journalists and outsiders to go to?
No, I'll be honest, I don't think for a foreigner, like, I would not claim to have got any definitive picture of the roots of the problem or why it's particularly got any worse now. I would challenge, I mean, somebody at some point may come along and do it, but that is a pretty difficult task. It's, you know, it's a murky area, and with no government agencies or anybody else to turn to, it's one of those things where hard evidence is difficult to come by. All you can do is rely on what one person said or another.
We've got time for just one last question. The gentleman at the back.
Yes, thank you very much. An awful lot of food for thought. This question is partly based on my observations when I was working in the Ukraine, and it also relates to the recent panorama about AMISOM operations in Mogadishu. You mentioned the four-wheel drives, you mentioned the villas, big villas. What do we know, and what perhaps is being done about the logistics of the piracy operations? The ammunition, the weapons, the marine fuel, and the land-based logistical needs, because it does seem that that's perhaps something that isn't mentioned.
Well, in terms of weapons, weapons are very easy to come by in Somalia. The place is awash with them and has been since, you know, the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Somali government. So there's never any problem to get weapons. Otherwise, in terms of logistics, what they need is remarkably little. You need a few skiffs with a few high-powered outboard engines on, and a couple of GPS locators. You don't need to be an expert sailor sailing by moon and stars. You can sail by GPS these days. So there is a limit to what they can do to hit the logistical basis, because there's a limit to the logistics that are required. I went on a Royal Naval patrol a couple of years ago, and they had helicopters flying up and down the Somali coast and spotting what they thought were suspected pirate camps. Most of them were not much more than just people living in a sort of temporary lean-to under a few palm trees or in a cave somewhere on the coast, and they can constantly move them around. So it's quite hard really to for any foreign vessels to, or any foreign forces to do much about that. There are bigger places like Ale and Haradiri, which are actual sort of what you might call pirate ports, where there is a lot more of the activity going on. But that is where you do come to the point that our previous speaker was making, which is that the international forces lack the jurisdiction to go onto land, and there are all sorts of issues there about staging, you know, land invasions or perhaps a limited incursion around one of these pirate towns. And certainly I think a lot of the naval commanders would probably quite like to do something like that, but you're then into a completely different ball game in terms of, you know, if you go onto the land, you then stir up all kinds of trouble that you might not get just by, you know, arresting people at sea.
Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to draw it to a close there, but Colin's going to be here behind at the end, signing books for those who want.
And going for a drink if
and going for a drink if anyone wants to join. So that's Colin's book, Kidnapped: Life as a Somali Pirate Hostage. Thanks very much, Colin, for coming to talk to us about that, and thanks very much for the Frontline Club.
Thank you all for coming.